Summer 1858, a dusty Apache rancheria near Llanos buzzes with life. Geronimo's off trading in town when 400 Mexican soldiers storm in. No warning, no mercy, just screams and blood. By the time he returns, his wife Alope, his mother Juana, and all three of his kids are dead, butchered in their own home. He's 29, and in that moment something snaps. He doesn't just grieve, he swears revenge. A vow that'll see him kill hundreds over decades. His name cursed from Chihuahua to Sonora. That's where this story starts. One man's rage igniting a 250-year blood feud that left 6,000 Mexicans and 1,000 Apache dead by 1850 alone. But why did Geronimo hate Mexico more than the Americans who caged him? And how did a nation's scalp bounties turn a hunter into a legend? Stick around, you're about to find out. Let's zoom out to the man Geronimo became. Fast forward to February 1909. He's 79 years old, lying on a cot in Fort Sill, Oklahoma, wheezing through pneumonia that's about to take him out. This isn't the warrior thundering across the Southwest anymore. This is an old man, a prisoner, one of the last Apache ripped from the life he knew. His body's failing, but his mind's still sharp, and it's burning with regret. He's not at peace. He's angry, replaying a life of war and a surrender he wished he could take back. That's where we meet him at the end. But to understand why, we've got to walk through the fire that forged him. Geronimo's war against the United States kicked off in 1861 and didn't stop until 1886. That's 25 years of fighting, a quarter century of blood spilled across the deserts and mountains of the Southwest. The Apache Wars weren't some tidy battlefield campaign. They were messy, brutal, personal. Geronimo saw his people pushed off their land, watched them tortured, killed, their whole way of life shredded. The Americans weren't just taking territory. They were erasing a culture. And Geronimo, he didn't sit quiet. He hit back just as hard. Raids, ambushes, you name it. He made sure the Americans felt the same pain. Over those years, he became a name that meant terror, a shadow moving through Arizona and New Mexico, leaving bodies in his wake. People called him a brutal warrior, and they weren't wrong. Hundreds fell to his hands, Americans and Mexicans alike. He didn't just fight to survive, he fought to punish. His raids were savage, calculated, the kind of violence that sticks in your head. A single attack could wipe out a settlement, livestock gone, men dead, families broken. He wasn't leading armies, he was running small bands, sometimes just a dozen warriors, but they hit like a storm. The numbers pile up over decades, hundreds of kills, no exaggeration. He earned that reputation, carved it out of flesh and bone, and by the time he was done, both sides knew his name meant death. But then came September 1886, Skeleton Canyon, Arizona. After years of running, dodging thousands of troops, Geronimo surrendered. Not because he was beaten, not really, but because the odds were suffocating. The U.S. had 5,000 soldiers on his trail. Mexico threw in 3,000 more. His band was down to 134 people. Men, women, kids, all starving, exhausted. He sat across from General Nelson Miles, agreed to lay down his rifle, and that was it. They shipped him east, eventually to Fort Sill, locked him up like an animal, and he hated it. Every day as a prisoner ate at him. He'd tell anyone who'd listen he regretted it, wished he'd kept fighting, died out there with a weapon in his hand instead of rotting in captivity. At 79, coughing his last breaths, he still dreamed of war. Now, here's the twist. As much as he fought the Americans, it was Mexico he despised most. That hatred was personal, a wound that never closed. Go back to 1858, that massacre at Llanos. His wife, his mom, his 3 kids all gone, slaughtered, by Mexican soldiers while he was trading in town. He came back to a nightmare. Bodies in the dirt, everything he loved torn apart. From that day, Mexico wasn't just an enemy. It was a target. He'd lead war parties south again and again, 4 times between 1859 and 1861 alone, killing, scalping, taking revenge any way he could. Even on his deathbed in 1909, he wasn't cursing the U.S. nearly as much as he was Mexico. He wanted to ride back there, raise hell one last time, make them pay for what they took. And he wasn't alone. All the Apache felt it. This wasn't just Geronimo's grudge, it was a shared fire, burning through every band, every tribe. Mexico had been grinding against them for centuries, longer than the U.S. ever did. From the Spanish days, in the 1600s to the scalp bounties of the 1830s, it was a blood feud that never let up. The Apache didn't just fight Mexico, they hated them, a deep, collective loathing that fueled raids and wars for 250 years. Geronimo was the loudest voice of that hate, but he was singing a song every Apache knew by heart. So how did it get this bad? Historical conflict between Apache and Mexico. Early conflict under Spanish rule. Let's dive into the early conflict between the Apache and Mexico. Starting way back when the land wasn't even called Mexico yet, it was still under Spanish rule. This goes all the way back to the 17th century, around the 1620s, when the Apache were already making life tough for the Spanish settlers in what's now northern Mexico, or back then, northern New Spain. The Apache weren't the type to sit still and let someone else call the shots. They'd been living their way, hunting, raiding, moving across the plains and mountains for generations, and they weren't about to bow down to some newcomers from across the ocean. So they started hitting Spanish settlements, grabbing cattle, horses, whatever they could carry off. It wasn't just about survival. It was their way of saying, "This is our land, and you don't get to tell us what to do." Naturally, this didn't sit well with the Spanish, and it kicked off a long, messy relationship that was more about contempt than cooperation. Fast forward to the 18th century, and things really heat up. By the 1780s, the Spanish had had enough of the Apache raids. They were losing livestock, people, and patience. So in 1786, they did something pretty drastic. They teamed up with the Comanche. Now, the Comanche and the Apache had been at each other's throats for about 200 years, fighting over territory and resources across the plains. The Spanish saw an opportunity and signed a peace treaty with the Comanche in Santa Fe. Suddenly, these two groups, who'd been enemies of the Apache for different reasons, were working together. And their goal? It wasn't just to push the Apache back, it was to wipe them out. This alliance turned into a brutal campaign, almost genocidal in scope. Thousands of Apache were killed, entire bands wiped out, as the Spanish and Comanche swept through their lands. By the late 18th century, the Apache were reeling. The raids that had kept the Spanish on edge for decades, they pretty much stopped. The Apache had been hit so hard they couldn't keep up the fight like before. So what happened next? By the 1790s, the Apache were in a tough spot. The plains, where they'd roamed freely, were too dangerous now with the Comanche and Spanish breathing down their necks. So thousands of them, probably between 2,000 and 3,000, pulled back into the mountains. It was safer there, harder for their enemies to follow. But that wasn't the only change. A lot of Apache ended up living near Spanish presidios, those military outposts like Llanos and Santa Rita. This wasn't exactly a surrender, but it was a shift. They weren't raiding as much anymore, and the Spanish saw a chance to keep things calm. They started handing out rations, about 10,000 pounds of food a year, at places like Llanos. The idea was simple. If the Apache had enough to eat, maybe they wouldn't feel the need to steal it. And for a while it worked. The Spanish even got some Apache to settle down a bit, going to their schools, taking Spanish names, even converting to Catholicism. It was a strange kind of peace, forced by necessity more than friendship. But here's the thing. This wasn't the Apache giving up who they were. They'd been beaten back, sure, but they were still Apache at heart. Hunters, raiders, people who lived by their own rules. The Spanish might have thought they were taming them, but they were really just buying time. The Apache took the food because they had to, not because they wanted to be Spanish. And the old ways, they weren't forgotten. The elders still remembered life before all this, and they passed those stories down. For the younger ones, it was only a generation or two back, when they were free to roam and fight. That memory didn't just fade away, it simmered. So, while the 1790s looked peaceful on the surface, it was more like a pause. The Apache were down, but they weren't out. And when the Spanish grip started to slip, as it would in the next century, all that tension was ready to boil over again. This uneasy truce set the stage for what came next when Mexico took over. And that's where the real blood feud kicked into gear. Mexican independence and renewed conflict. Mexico broke free from Spain in September 1821 after a brutal decade-long war against Spain that began in 1810. The new Mexican government inherited a lot from the Spanish, including an uneasy arrangement with the Apache. For years, the Spanish had kept things quiet by handing out rations, about 10,000 pounds of food a year, at presidios like Llanos and Santa Rita. It was a practical move. Feed the Apache, keep them close, and maybe they won't raid your towns. Mexico, at first, tried to stick with that plan. They kept the food coming, hoping to maintain the fragile peace the Spanish had built in the 1790s, when thousands of Apache had settled near those outposts, going to school, taking Spanish names, and even picking up Catholicism. But Mexico was a brand new country and strapped for cash. Fighting a revolution drained resources, and by the early 1830s, the money just wasn't there. Around 1831, the government had to make tough calls, one of them being slashing those rations. They didn't cut them entirely, but they dropped from 1,000 pounds a year to maybe 2,000 or 3,000 at most. For the Apache, that changed everything. They'd grown used to the food, relied on it, and now it was fading fast. So they left the Mexican towns they'd been living near and turned back to what they knew. By 1832, the raids started again. They weren't picking fights for kicks. They were after survival: cattle, horses, food, guns, ammunition, anything they could grab from Mexican ranches and settlements. Both sides saw it completely differently. The Mexicans felt betrayed, like the Apache had broken a deal. Back in the 1790s, when the Spanish set up the ration system, the expectation was that the Apache would farm outside the presidios, grow their own food, and the rations were just a bonus to keep them content. Mexico held on to that, arguing, "You're supposed to be self-sufficient, not depending on us forever." But the Apache had a different take. They'd never really been farmers, not at their core. Some might have worked a little land near the presidios, but that wasn't who they were. They were hunters, raiders, semi-nomadic people who took what they needed when the land didn't provide. For them, the rations weren't extra, they were essential, and when Mexico cut back, it felt like a betrayal. Plus, their old ways weren't ancient history, just 1 or 2 generations back. The elders still remembered, and they taught the young ones fast. Raiding wasn't new, it was instinct. At first, those raids weren't about killing. The Apache targeted resources, livestock, supplies, stuff they could use or trade. But people don't just give up their cattle and guns without a fight. Ranchers and settlers defended their livelihoods, and violence crept in quick. It didn't take long for blood to spill, and once that happened, things escalated. The Mexican government tried to talk peace, but it was doomed from the start. The Apache weren't one unified group you could negotiate with. They were divided into tribes: Chiricahua, Mescalero, Jicarilla, Western Apache, and then into smaller bands, sometimes just a couple hundred people. Mexico might convince one band to stand down, but the next one didn't care. With a couple thousand Apache out there, most weren't signing on to any truce. Meanwhile, the Mexicans couldn't grasp how the Apache operated, and the Apache didn't understand Mexico either. They'd make a deal with a town like Llanos and think, "We're good here," then raid the next one over, like Sonora or Chihuahua, because they didn't see it as part of the same agreement. To them, it was local, not national. That misunderstanding fueled the chaos that would only grow worse in the coming years. Mexican policies and escalation, 1833 to 1839. By 1833, the situation between Mexico and the Apache was spiraling out of control. The Mexican government wanted peace, but they couldn't figure out how to make it stick. The Apache weren't one big group you could sit down with and hash things out. Their population was somewhere between 5,000 and 8,000, spread across 4 main tribes: Chiricahua, Mescalero, Jicarilla, and Western Apache, and then broken down further into dozens of smaller bands. Each band operated on its own, maybe a couple hundred people at most. Mexico might talk one band into a truce, but that didn't mean the others were on board. You'd have a deal with one group, and meanwhile, a couple thousand Apache were still out there, doing whatever they wanted. It was like trying to herd cats with no fence. The government couldn't wrap their heads around this setup, and it made any real peace impossible. The Apache didn't help things with how they saw those deals either. To them, an agreement wasn't some grand nationwide thing. It was local. If they made peace with a town like Llanos, they'd trade there, keep things cool, and figure they were square. But then they'd roll over to Sonora or Chihuahua and raid like nothing had changed, because in their minds, they hadn't promised those places anything. Mexico, on the other hand, thought they were negotiating for the whole country, or at least big chunks like Chihuahua or Sonora. They couldn't get why the Apache didn't see it that way. It was a total clash of how they understood the world, and it just poured fuel on the fire. With peace talks going nowhere, Mexico decided to get serious. Starting in 1833, they beefed up their defenses. They scraped together 50,000 pesos from civilians, basically passing the hat around to fund the fight. They even cut state officials' salaries by 20% to free up more cash, which I bet didn't make them popular. In Chihuahua, where a lot of the trouble was, they went further, ordering every man to carry a weapon at all times and join local defense forces. This wasn't just a suggestion, it was the law. They were dealing with about 200 Apache raids a year, and people were desperate. Homes, ranches, whole towns were getting hit, and Mexico was scrambling to keep up. Then things took a darker turn. In July 1835, Sonora rolled out a scalp bounty. They'd pay 100 pesos for the scalp of an adult male Apache, 50 for a woman, and 25 for a kid. It was grim, no question, but they figured it'd scare the Apache into backing off. By 1837, Chihuahua upped the ante, offering 200 pesos for a male scalp. The idea was to hit the Apache hard, make every raid cost them. But it wasn't just about scalps. They started taking prisoners, too, mostly women and children, and sending them into slavery. Hundreds got caught up in this, shipped off to work who knows where. It was brutal, and it didn't even work that well. The Apache knew their land better than anyone, and a lot of them slipped away. Take Francesca, for instance. She got nabbed, escaped into the wild, and ended up in a fight with a mountain lion. She killed it with just a knife, walked away scarred but alive, and years later, in 1852, married Geronimo. He didn't mind the scars, apparently had other wives to look at. Point is, slavery didn't break the Apache, it just made them madder. Mexico thought these hardline moves, bounties, slavery, all of it would crush the Apache spirit. They figured fear would keep them in line. But that's not how the Apache rolled. They were tough, used to surviving in a harsh world, and this kind of punishment didn't scare them off. It lit a fuse. Every scalp taken, every person enslaved, just pushed them to hit back harder. The government was escalating, sure, but they were also digging themselves deeper into a fight they couldn't win. The Apache weren't going to fold, they were going to make Mexico pay. And that's exactly what started happening as the 1830s rolled on. Deception Tactics and Apache Response, 1837 to 1839. By 1837, Mexico was getting craftier in their fight against the Apache, leaning hard into deception to gain the upper hand. One of the ugliest examples hit in April that year near the Santa Rita copper mine. A guy named John Johnson, leading a Mexican group, spotted 50 Apache camped out, led by Juan Jose, a man who'd actually gone to Mexican schools back in the Presidio days. Johnson played it friendly, inviting them in with promises of flour and liquor, stuff the Apache weren't about to turn down. But it was a trap. While they were eating and drinking, Johnson's crew surrounded them, and without warning, they opened up with a cannon and rifles. Juan Jose and about 20 others were cut down in the chaos. It was cold-blooded, no question, and it showed just how far Mexico was willing to go. The Apache didn't let that slide. Juan Jose's death left a gap, and Mangus Coloradas stepped up, a war chief who'd proved to be one of their best. He hit back fast. In May 1838, he led a raid that took out 22 fur trappers near Santa Rita, sending a clear message. Then he turned it up a notch. When locals, spooked by the violence, tried to flee to the Llanos Presidio, 300 or 400 of them, Mangus ambushed them on the way. Most didn't make it, either killed or captured. The fallout was so bad the Santa Rita copper mine shut down, staying closed for decades, all the way to 1872. Mangus wasn't just fighting, he was making Mexico feel the cost. Alcohol played a big role in all this too. Mexico figured out the Apache liked to drink, and they used it against them. Get them liquored up, and they're easier to hit. It happened so often that by 1840, Some Apache leaders put a rule in place: only half the warriors could drink at celebrations. They'd learned the hard way that Mexico wasn't above striking when they were off guard. These tricks and the Apaches' brutal response just deepened the hate on both sides, pushing the feud into even uglier territory. Continued suppression and resistance, 1839 to 1850. Mexico wasn't ready to back off, even after their tricks and bounties stirred up more trouble. In June 1839, they put together an army of 200 men, led by a North American named James Kirker, to go after the Apache hard. Kirker didn't mess around. He and his troops killed about 150 Apache over the next few months. Problem was, they didn't care much about who they were hitting. Some of those were friendly bands, groups that were actually trying to talk peace with Mexico. Instead of calming things down, this just lit a bigger fire. The Apache who survived or heard about it didn't sit quiet. They ramped up their raids, striking back with more fury than before. Mexico kept swinging, but they were hitting the wrong targets half the time and making enemies out of potential allies. Years later, another Apache leader stepped into the spotlight. Whoa, sometimes called Ja. This guy's story picks up stronger around 1860, but it's worth mentioning here because it shows how the fight kept simmering. By 1877, the Americans were trying to force his band onto the San Carlos Reservation, a place Whoa saw as nothing but a cage. He said no way and took his people south into Mexico instead. To him, the Mexicans were invaders squatting on Chiricahua land, and he wasn't about to let that slide. In 1865, Chihuahua's governor, Luis Terrazas, tried talking to him. The raids were bleeding the region dry, with something like 10,000 cattle stolen between 1860 and 1870. Terrazas practically begged Whoa to stick to taking male cattle, leave the females so the herds wouldn't collapse. Whoa got that part, but when the governor pushed him to stop killing and scalping Mexicans, he lost it. Whoa shot back that the Apache didn't even scalp until Mexico put bounties on their heads. They'd learned it from them. It was a bitter standoff, and no deal came out of it. Speaking of those bounties, by the 1850s, Mexico's scalp hunting scheme was falling apart. From 1840 to 1850, they'd shelled out 5,000 pesos for about 2,000 scalps. But here's the catch. The whole Apache population was only around 6,000. Do the math, and it's clear something was off. Turns out, a lot of those scalps weren't even Apache. They were from Mexicans or other tribes, maybe even some poor random folks caught in the wrong place. The government caught on, realized they were getting played, and started scaling back the payouts in 1855. It was a mess, and all it did was prove how out of control things had gotten. Conflict casualties, 1830 to 1850. This whole feud left a brutal mark on both sides. From 1831 to 1850, the body count piled up, especially in Chihuahua and Sonora, where most of the fighting went down. Estimates say about 5,000 to 6,000 Mexicans died, caught up in raids, ambushes, and straight-up battles. The Apache took heavy losses too, somewhere between 1,000 and 1,500 killed. It wasn't just people, though. The raids gutted the region's economy. Around 10,000 cattle got snatched over those 2 decades, a staggering number that left ranches crippled and towns on edge. Every death and every stolen cow just dug the hatred deeper, locking both sides into a cycle they couldn't break. For the Mexicans, it was about survival and holding on to what they had. For the Apache, it was about fighting back against a world that kept trying to crush them. The numbers tell the story, but they don't capture the raw anger driving it all. That's what kept this blood feud alive, ready to flare up again with guys like Geronimo down the road. Geronimo and the feud's climax. Family massacre and vow of revenge, 1858. Geronimo's hatred for Mexico didn't just come out of nowhere, it was forged in blood. In June 1858, he was off trading in a nearby town when 400 Mexican soldiers from Sonora swept into an Apache rancheria near Llanos. The men were mostly gone, leaving the camp defenseless. The soldiers didn't hold back. They slaughtered whoever they found. Among the dead were Geronimo's wife, Alo, his mother, Juana, and his 3 young children. He came back to find his whole world ripped apart Bodies scattered, everything he loved gone. That day broke something in him, but it also lit a fire. He swore he'd make Mexico pay, a vow of vengeance that'd drive him for the rest of his life. He didn't waste time. By October 1859, Geronimo had rounded up 200 warriors and marched them into Sonora, straight for Arispe, a town that used to be the state capital, until Apache raids forced it to move. His plan was ruthless. 8 of his men went in first, hitting the outskirts, killing and scalping 20 Mexican men, grabbing 10 women and children. It wasn't just violence, it was bait. When the town found the bodies, they'd send troops after the culprits, and Geronimo was waiting. Sure enough, by 10 a.m. the next day, 2 columns of infantry, about 100 men, and 50 cavalry came charging up the mountains. Geronimo claimed he recognized that cavalry, said they were the same ones who'd massacred his family the year before. Whether that's true or not, he fought like it was personal. The battle kicked off hard, lasting 2 hours. The Apache usually hit and ran, but not this time. Geronimo led a head-on charge. It got ugly fast. Late in the fight, he found himself in a field with 4 other warriors, out of arrows, spears broken. All he had was a knife, but that was enough. He darted between soldiers, dodging their sabers, and took down 5 to 7 of them in close, bloody combat. At one point, it was just him and 1 other Apache left in the thick of it. He watched a Mexican run his friend through with a saber, and Geronimo snapped. He charged the guy, grappled with him, both of them wrestling for the kill. They hit the ground, and Geronimo got the upper hand, driving his knife in for the final blow. Exhausted, he lay there, soaked in enemy blood, then grabbed the soldier's saber and pulled himself up. Around him, the field was littered with dead Mexicans, his surviving warriors staring at him in awe. They let out a war whoop, scouted the bodies, and left. That fight was Geronimo's revenge taking shape. Origin of Geronimo name 1859. That Arispe battle also sparked a story about his name. Geronimo was born Goyathlay, meaning one who yawns in Apache. Some say during that 1859 fight, as he tore through soldiers with his knife, the Mexicans started yelling Geronimo, Spanish for Jerome, maybe pleading to Saint Jerome for help. It's a wild tale, but Geronimo never mentioned it in his autobiography. Others think it was simpler, just Mexicans mangling Goyathlay into something they could say. Either way, the name stuck after that day, and it'd follow him like a shadow. Further attacks, 1859 to 1880. Geronimo didn't stop there. Between 1859 and 1861, he led 4 more war parties into Mexico, each with 50 to 100 warriors. They killed around 200 Mexicans in those raids, hitting towns and travelers hard. But it cost him 30 to 40 Apache died in the process. His own people started grumbling, saying his rage was reckless, that the Apache couldn't afford to lose so many with their numbers already thin. Still, plenty hated Mexico enough to follow him. By 1860, his name was a curse on Mexican lips, showing up in over 50 battles according to Apache stories. He was a nightmare they couldn't shake. Later years, 1880 to 1909. In October 1880, Mexico scored a win, killing Chief Vittorio at Tres Castillos. That left Geronimo, never a formal chief, as a go-to leader for about 300 Chiricahua. He kept fighting. In April 1885, he broke out of San Carlos with 134 Apache, heading back into Mexico, chased by 5,000 U.S. troops and 3,000 Mexicans. He dodged them until September 1886, when he finally surrendered. Exiled to Fort Sill by 1894, he spent his last years there, putting his story down in an autobiography from 1905 to 1906. Even then, his hatred for Mexico burned bright, every word dripping with it. That feud defined him to the end. The blood feud between Mexico and the Apache was a brutal, unrelenting clash that stretched over 250 years. From 1830 to 1880 alone, Mexico killed 3,000 to 4,000 Apache, hoping to crush them into submission with scalp bounties, slavery, and massacres. But the Apache weren't the type to buckle. Every attack just fueled their retaliation, turning a tense standoff into a vicious cycle of hate. Both sides dug in deeper, each act of violence piling onto centuries of bad blood, until revenge was all they knew. It wasn't just a fight for land or survival, it was personal. and it left scars neither could heal. This story of the Apache in Mexico leaves us with a raw lesson. Violence doesn't end hate, it feeds it. For 250 years, every blow traded between them only tightened the knot of vengeance, showing how cycles of pain can trap people in a fight with no winners. Geronimo's fury, the Broncos' last stand in 1934 at Sierra Madre, it all echoes the same truth. Defiance and desperation can outlast even the toughest attempts to break a spirit. It's a heavy tale, but worth chewing on. If it hit you like it did me, give it a like, share it with someone, and stick around for more. Catch you next time.